there room for me? There's not room for me. If there's room for me.
Can't hear me? I'm sorry. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'll start again. Welcome. It's good to see friends in the audience and see Sam and the team. I'm honored to introduce these two incredible speakers and this incredible topic, which I think is very, very, very important. We're talking about policy initiatives, and these two expert labor economists will talk about the impact of various policy initiatives on the American workforce, which I think is sort of a good place to start this program. We're joined by two wonderful academics in background. Solomon Pollacheck is a distinguished professor at Binghamton University, State University of New York at Binghamton, where he's taught since 1983. At Binghamton, he holds appointments in the economics and the political science departments, and he has served in the past as the Dean of the Arts and Science College. His PhD is from Columbia, which is under attack, and he has postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Chicago and Stanford University. He has various research areas where his contribution has been extensive. First is the application of lifestyle models to labor economics. He could explain that in much better than I could. And second is the integration of economics and political science to explain conflict and cooperation between nations. And at one point in his past, he's still active, but he was president of the Peace Science Society International. We're also joined by Yi Zhang, who is the director at Resolution Economics LLC, an economics, statistics, forensic accounting, and economic damages consulting firm with offices throughout the United States. He has a PhD and MA degrees in economics from the University of Maryland and a BA in economics from Fudan University in Shanghai, China. He's a labor economist with significant experience in economic modeling and statistical analysis, and many of the lawyers in this room have worked with him and with his organization. The topics that they're going to cover this morning include migration, tariffs, DEI, focusing on gender, race, and merit-based opportunity, artificial intelligence, and working from home, all important issues in today's workplace. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Pollacheck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. We do appreciate that, and thanks for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure. As was, let's see, I have to figure out how this.
Into the microphone. Speak into the microphone.
I also have to figure out how this thing works. Is there a button here? Let's see if this works. Here we go. Okay, so as was mentioned, I'm going to talk about three topics: migration, tariffs, and aspects of gender. So let's start with migration. What I have here is a chart, and this chart indicates the levels of what we call foreign-born individuals in the United States. And as you can see, there are about 53 million foreign-born people in the United States now in about 2025. That's, as you can see, the highest level ever. And the percent of foreign-born people in the United States is about 15%. That, again, is the highest level since about the 1900s. So clearly, immigrants and immigration and the number of foreign-born is an important question that is a topic that needs to be addressed and is being addressed and has been addressed in the last few years. So that's an important question, and so the issue is really, is migration, is the number of foreign-born good or bad to the country? And as we know in economics, there's different opinions. So on the one hand, there's an article by David Card, who's a Nobel laureate, another by George Borjas, who's a very prominent economist, now in the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration, and there are some differing opinions, and I'll talk about that. So what economics generally says about immigration is that if you have an influx, or if you have an influx of workers in a labor market, generally what one would see is the increase in supply should cause a decrease in wages, as one would normally expect. It's a simple supply and demand model. So in about 1990, David Card did a study, a very prominent study, and he wanted to check out an experiment of what happened in what's called the Mario boat lift. So in 1980, Castro let out about 120,000 people from Cuba, and they mostly entered they entered the United States mostly in the Miami labor market. So in 1980, there was a gigantic influx of immigrants from Cuba into the Miami market. That was about 8% of the labor force, about 8% of the labor force, and that increased the number of Latinos in Miami by about 20%. So economic theory would say that there should be a tremendous decline in wages. So if you look at the first chart on top, what David Card did is he did an experiment, and he wanted to see what happened actually in the Miami labor market compared to similar labor markets in representative countries, what they call placebo labor markets. And if you can see in 1980, not much changed between the placebo labor markets and the Miami labor market. They follow the same time trends. So the conclusion of this study is that this in-migration does not really harm workers, does not even harm the native workers in very much of any way. On the other hand, George Borjas found that what David Card did not do is he did not look at the market for low-educated workers, which is what the new Mario boat lift workers were. And so when he looked at workers that are less than college educated, it turns out that there was a dramatic drop in their relative wages, as indicated on the diagram below. So there's a difference of opinion as to what is the impact of immigrants in a labor market. On the one hand, some people say it has no effect. On the other hand, someone says it actually could have a detrimental effect. But of course, the issue nowadays is not necessarily the immigrants in general, but it's the rise in illegal immigrants. And you can see that there are about 15.8 million illegal immigrants. And the question then one might want to ask is, well, are illegal immigrants different than regular immigrants? And there's some data that seems to indicate that it turns out that illegal immigrants turn out not individual cases, but as a group, they commit less crimes than even Native Americans. So the diagram look at the graphs on the right side of the panel, but this is the proportion of Native Americans that commit crime, but or commit homicides. If you look at the diagrams on the right side, the light gray one and the dark gray one, it turns out that both immigrants and illegal immigrants commit half of the homicides, half of per I guess, relative to the population of the U.S. than Native Americans. That's a study that's done by Cato Institute with respect to immigrants and illegal immigrants in Texas. The graphs on the right is done by American Immigration Council, which is a more liberal council that's more interested in the rights of immigrants. And that shows also that there's a sharper decrease in committing a crime and arrests by immigrants, illegal immigrants, than for the native population. So that's a study which seems to indicate that immigration is really not so bad, and that illegal immigrants really commit less crime on average than Native Americans. But of course, there is another issue, is not every illegal immigrant is bad, but some are bad. And so there was a Secure Communities program, which came about in about 2008 to about 2014, which enabled organizations or the FBI and ICE and so on to share to share information about illegal immigrants so as to catch the so-called bad apples in the group. And it turned out that because of Secure Communities program, about 480,000 people were arrested or deported. And the question is, what did that do to local labor markets? Well, of course, if you take out a lot of people from a local labor market, then it means that employment should go down. And we don't know what it probably should, maybe wages should go up or not be affected by very much. So the LEFB stands for the low educated foreign born, and it turns out that there was a decrease in the low educated foreign born laborers by about 4%. But what happened to the US workers? And one would expect that if you take out workers from a labor market, the US wages would rise, and that's what a lot of the argument is. But it turns out that a recent study that was done in the Journal of Labor Economics, which is a University of Chicago journal, a couple years ago, found out that the US wages for US-born people in those local labor markets did not rise, but in fact actually fell by about 0.5%, and the employment fell about 0.5%. So it turned out that even having a program of secure communities, which indeed would take out the bad apples, did not detrimentally or did not lead to a rise in wages, but led to a decline of wages for U.S. workers. Okay, let me move on and talk a little bit about a second topic. The second topic is tariffs. And if you can see by this graph with the sharp red line on the right, that tariffs or the proposed tariffs are to increase it to about a level which was just prior to the Great Depression in 1929. So the proposed tariffs are relatively high, and the question is that fairly good or bad on the economy? So Goldman Sachs looked at this, and they looked at it in a couple ways. What they did is they took a number of studies about the economy. So there are a number of macro models, and they looked at what is the impact on employment of these gigantic or these proposed gigantic tariffs. And if you look at what the Goldman Sachs studies found, they found that on average, and I have to look at the screen here to see what it is, it looks like there are two kinds of effects. If you have a tariff, then basically there's protected industry, and that should imply that there's more manufacturing jobs in the U.S., or more jobs from the protected industries, so you should see a rise in U.S. employment, but at the same time, there's less trade, there's higher prices, and that should have tertiary effects. So in the Goldman Sachs study, they found that there's about a 40,000 employee increase in the protected industries, but about a 250,000 job decline in the tertiary industries, or a net loss in jobs. So the claim that's made is that there's a net loss in jobs if we go to very high tariffs. I think from an economics point of view, the optimal tariff is essentially zero for all countries involved. That would therefore cause lower prices and greater efficiencies in the world economy, and perhaps greater efficiencies in the U.S. economy as well. But actually, it turns out that high tariffs cause low trade or less trade, and as was mentioned, I did some work in political science, and there's a field called conflict and trade. And in that field of conflict and trade, it basically says that if there's greater amounts of trade between countries, there's greater dependencies, and that should lead to a lower amount of political conflict, which means a lower amount of war. And in studies, for example, that I and others have done, it finds out that, for example, if you have a 25% decrease in trade, that should lead to about a 5% increase in conflict, or basically a 5% increase in the probability of war. So tariffs as a whole are something that economists uniformly believe is not a good idea, and that, of course, if we have negotiations to get to zero tariffs between all countries, that might actually be a good thing. It'd be a good thing economically, and a good thing politically if we look at the worldwide conflict and cooperation in the world. Next topic that I want to talk about is gender and gender differences. And of course, the newspaper has done a lot in talking about the gender wage gap, which is now about 20%, between 18 and 22%. In the old days, when I first started looking at this, the gender wage gap was about 40%, and there's even a folk song which is called 59 cents on the dollar, where back in 1960, 70, and 80, women were earning 59 cents for every man's dollar, essentially. But there's some facts about the gender wage gap which a lot of people don't see in the newspaper. One is that the gender wage gap for new workers or relatively young workers is relatively small. It's small compared to what happens for older workers. So the gender wage gap essentially is narrow, but then gets wider and wider as people move through the occupational ladder and through the labor force. So in this data over here that I have, it says that the wage gap for young workers is about 5%, women earning about 95 cents on the dollar, but for older workers, it's about 25%. Now, what's really interesting is that the wage gap also varies, and the biggest predictor of the wage gap is marital status and number of children. So the column I have far on the right it's hard to see, I guess, but and I apologize for that. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that the patterns in the gender wage gap are true for essentially all countries. And so this is data from the Luxembourg Income Study, which is a kind of a CPS-type study for all or various countries. They have about 70 of them. But if you look at the gender wage gap for single, never marrieds, it's about like in the 5% range. Sometimes there's no gender wage gap, sometimes it's 88%, but it's basically between 0 and 10%. If you look at the column in the middle, it's the gender wage gap for basically cohabitating people that have children under 6, and the wage gap is about like 50%. So the biggest predictor of the wage gap is essentially having children. Now, why is having children such an important factor? Because it turns out that having children is very, very related to gender differences in labor force participation. So in this graph over here, I have what they call labor force participation rate, and I also have the degree of part-time labor force participation. So if you look at the gender for labor force participation rate of, for example, men and women with children under 6, for example, 95% of the men with children under 6 are employed or in the labor force, whereas only about 68% of the women are in the labor force. And if you look at the part-time aspects, 23% of women with children under 6 are part-time workers, whereas only 4% are males. So it turns out that lifetime, or that labor force participation, and it's true, lifetime labor force participation is it's crucially important in understanding the gender wage gap. Well, why is that the case? It's the case because the degree of labor force participation, even at a point in time and over one's whole lifetime, is related to the kinds of investments that people make in the kinds of jobs that they want, the human capital that they buy, and it's related to some characteristics of the job. Do I want to take a job that requires commuting a long distance? Do I want to take a job that requires a lot of continued investment? Do I want to take a job that has a lot of depreciation if I drop out to raise children? Do I want to take a job that requires a lot of travel? And there's differences in this demand. And it turns out that if you look at studies that look at very, very narrow descriptions of jobs, and I'm going to talk about one particular study which was done about a year or two ago about Uber drivers, where you can actually have exact measures of productivity, it turns out that the gender wage gap is about 40% between male and female Uber drivers. Well, if you adjust for hours alone, then the gap falls to about 7%. And then if you adjust for the experience as a rideshare driver, the gap falls to 2.5%. And then it turns out that men and women Uber drivers pick different locations, safer versus unsafe locations. The gap falls to about 1%. And it turns out, this is interesting, that male drivers drive faster than women drivers. And so if you adjust for the speed of driving, the gap actually falls to essentially 0, with actually women having about a 0.2% advantage. And that's a recent study that was done actually about a couple years ago, because of course Uber driving is kind of fairly recent. So what's the moral of this? Well, the moral of this is that over time, the fertility rates have gone down. From, I guess, I have data from about 1900 to about 2000s. And as fertility rates went down, lifetime labor force participation of women has gone up. And so you can see men have been dropping a little bit in their work activities, but women's labor force participation has been rising. So when I was a graduate student a long time ago, there were very few women in law school. Now there's probably more women than men in law school. The same was true in dental school and medical school. The only lag right now is science and engineering. But women are increasingly increasing their role in the labor force, men slightly decreasing their roles in the labor force, and that's led to a rise in the female wages relative to male wages. So when I started looking at this, the gap in wages was about 40%. It was actually higher in 1890, probably about 55%, but nowadays the gap is actually smaller and shrinking. Now, of course, it hasn't shrunk to zero for the economy as a whole, as many people would like, but at least it's on the right trajectory. So what's the moral of all this with respect to gender? The moral of all this with respect to gender is that lifetime labor force participation is important, and the problem is that it's hampered by the fact that for some reason in our society, women are more shackled with the role of childcare responsibilities, and that affects them dramatically in the labor market. So I have a graph here, and I'll conclude with this graph about what important policy implication that I've been advocating for a long time is that if we can have better daycare centers which are more available and perhaps free, it turns out that that would actually decrease the gender wage gap. So on this graph over here, there are a bunch of countries, each with some initials, and I'm not going to go through it, but it turns out that the countries that have a greater proportion of the children in daycare have the lowest gender wage gap. So the moral of the story is lifetime labor force participation is important. Advocating for better, more available child care at low cost should decrease the gender wage gap. So the three important issues that I was looking at was migration, one, which is in general, probably good for the economy, but in the short run, probably bad for some workers. It turns out, so migration is an important issue. The second issue is tariffs. Economists generally would prefer zero tariffs because that increases trade, increases growth, decreases prices, decreases the probability of international conflict. And with respect to gender, the third important topic that I'm looking at is that things are getting better for women relative to men, and that the greater the lifetime labor force participation and the availability or how we make it easier for women to work over their lifetime, the better off women will be relative to men and the better off society will be. And so thank you. We accept any questions, of course. Thanks.
All right, great. So so first of all, I'm not going to talk about AI today because I talked about it last year, and I wanted to give more relevant material related to the current administration. So I am going to talk about an alternative topic, which is manufacturing jobs. Thanks to the suggestion of my colleague Vicky Lipnick, who actually suggested this topic. So I'm going to start with racial earnings gap, which essentially follow Saul's discussion on gender. And then I'm going to talk about manufacturing jobs in the United States and this relationship to trade and tariffs. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some research on work from home, as well as return to office mandate. So those are very recent statistics that I think sharing with you all might be beneficial. So a little bit of history on the racial earnings gap in the United States. The stubborn persistence of racial differences in many socioeconomic outcomes, including earning, has been a reality in the United States labor market for many, many, many decades. So as you can see from this graph here, which is a black-white earnings gap for black and white workers for the last 75 years, and from two data series. One is from the census data, the decennial census, and the other is from the current population survey. This is a March supplement of the current population survey, which you can get earnings data. And that didn't start until 1962, so that series starts from 1962. But the two series of data demonstrate the exact same pattern, is that during the last 75 years, the only incidence where we see a significant drop in black-white earnings is actually during the 60s and 70s. And I'm sure that many of you have your own opinion on what's the causes of these huge drops, and many economists, labor economists, written hundreds of papers literally on this topic. And we like to sort of explain things with supply and demand. On the demand side, I think all of you here knows more than I do on this topic. Is during the 60s, there are many federal anti-discrimination legislation being put in place. So employers start to hire more and more black workers. And on the supply side, that's also a time where we see a significant increase in black population's education. And then supply and demand, and then the institutions, the labor market institutions. So one important institution feature is the Fair Labor Standards Act. You might ask, oh, that's 1937, the minimum wage statute put into place in 1937, so why that happens in 1960s? So there's a very interesting recent study actually points out that when the Fair Labor Standards put in place in 1937, the coverage of sectors for the minimum wage is actually quite limited. It's limited to mostly interstate commerce. So a lot of the black population, of black workers were actually excluded from the minimum wage, from the wage floor back in 1938. So the amendments to the FLSA in the 1967 especially expanded the coverage of the minimum wage, and that's what we see as the one contributing factor to the sharp drop in the black and white earnings gap. But meanwhile, as you can also see from this graph, that since 1980s, this gap is essentially stays the same. It's around 25, 30, 40%. And the most recent data, here's from the last quarter, as you can see. The black workers is earning, the median weekly earnings of black workers is around $1,200, around $1,000, and for white is $1,200. So we're talking about a little bit more than 20% difference. And that has been going on for a few decades. And if you remember that Saul has mentioned that the most significant feature of the U.S. labor market in the last few decades is the significant increase in the female labor force participation. On the flip side of that, another significant change in the U.S. labor market for the last few decades is the declining labor force participation rates for men. And as you can also see here, that the racial earnings gap between black workers and white workers is more significant for men than women. And this has been the case for many, many years. As a matter of fact, the situation might be worse than what you have observed here because of the situation of non-work. So there are some very recent studies that has delved into this issue and paint a much pessimistic picture for the racial earnings gap in the last few decades, and I want to sort of mention that. And it's related to non-work. So I want to point it out to this sort of, these are different measures of non-work. You can measure non-work from survey data that asking what is your earnings, and you can sort of plot out all the people that answer zero earnings. Or there are questions about whether you are working, whether you are currently working. So let's focus on whether you are currently working or not. As you can see, there is a significant there's a significant racial gap in that. So the top line there is for not currently working blacks. So what you can see here, that ever since the 1980s, there's a huge increase in non-working black population. And there's also an increase in the non-working white population, but over time, the gap increases. So if you're talking about earnings gap between black and white, if you're only looking at the working population, because of this, you are actually missing a big part of it. So a lot of you might ask the question, what causes this? Why there's a sort of a gradual increase in black and white non-work incidence over time? And the same study actually pointed out, if you look at the gap between black and white in this graph, only 20% of them is due to unemployment. 45% of that gap is due to incarceration. And 35% of that gap is due to non-incarceration but non-employment. So those are the people that are not in the labor force. So again, if you ignore this feature, between the black and white population, you're going to severely understate the black and white earnings gap if you only focus on black and white workers. And what's the real picture then? This is the real picture. If you look at the median earners, meaning that if you look at the middle earner in the black population versus the middle earner in the white population, I'm talking about population, I'm not talking about workers. That's the bottom line in there. What you can see is, let's take a look at 2014, which is the year after, which is a few years after the Great Recession caused by the sort of the mortgage crisis and stuff like that. As you can see there, in 2014, the black and white earnings gap at the median is actually sitting at the level of 1950s, which is a completely different story than this one in here. It's quite stable after 1980s. But if you take into account the entire population instead of just looking at workers, you see a huge different picture. And this also, but the situation is much better if you look at the higher part of the earning distribution. If you look at the 90th percentile of the population, it didn't experience the gap didn't experience the sharp drop since the 1980s. So what does this mean for policymakers? So if you think about the top of the earnings distribution for blacks and for whites, those are the section of the earnings distribution that some of the targeting policies, such as anti-discrimination laws, desegregation, and stuff like that, will have a bite. And that's why we didn't see that drop after 1980s. But for the lower part of the earnings distribution, some kind of a general policy to support low-income workers, low-wage workers, might be more effective because black workers are more highly concentrated in that part of the distribution. So this is sort of a general story coming out of these new studies. And then I know that a lot of you will say, oh, these are just raw gaps. Many of you involved in cases related to class action discrimination. Oh, we always control for things when we talk about earnings. Yes, so here are some sort of classic studies in labor economics where we try to control things, and one important thing to control when you compare black and white earnings is their ability. So what is a reasonable measure of ability? I think that many of you probably remember this book, The Bell Curve, in the middle 1990s by Herrnstein and Morey. And one important feature of that book is to use the AFQT score as a measure of cognitive ability. The Armed Force Qualification Test, which is a composite score from, I think they call it ASVAB. There is 4 batteries of tests that sort of sum up to that. And here is the black and white earnings regressions. Probably many of you have run this type of regressions in your pay equity studies. I run them day in and day out. And if you take a look at this, for men and women, the gap between black and white earnings difference is significantly reduced once the AFQT score is controlled for. For male, it reduced by 75%. For female, it's essentially being wiped out. So this study by Derek Neal and Bill Johnson I think came out in the middle 1990s. It's very influential in terms of reminding us that a lot of these gaps is not due to the policy on the labor market. It's actually due to the abilities, the cognitive part of things that people brought to the labor market. So focusing on pre-market interventions might help us to somehow remediate these kind of differences that we see. And this is a further evidence that controlling things sometimes do not wipe out all the difference. So that's all I want to talk about in terms of racial earnings gaps. What about manufacturing? So this is manufacturing jobs is at least one of the rationales that the current presidents used to implement tariffs and initiating all these kind of trade wars. And I want to give a little bit of a history of the manufacturing jobs in the United States, as you can see here. So the orange line there is the level, is the level of employment for manufacturing jobs in the United States from the Second World War to now. And then the blue line there is the percentage of manufacturing jobs in total employment in the United States. As you can see there, before 1980s, the employment of the manufacturing sectors actually was experiencing a steady cyclical growth. But ever since the 1980s, it's declining, right? And in some decades, it's declined a little more than the others. For example, in the 90s, at the beginning of the 90s, it declined a little more, but in the second half of the 90s, because the overall economy was pretty good, so we actually see a slightly uptake in the manufacturing employment. But then we experienced a sharp decline in the manufacturing jobs in between 2000 and 2010, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But the general pattern is, ever since the 1980s, we see this decline pattern of the manufacturing jobs, and in the percentage as well. So currently we have around 11 million, 12 million manufacturing jobs, and less than 10% of U.S. employment is manufacturing jobs. So, so what does labor economists think about the impact of trade and things like tariffs on these manufacturing jobs? Before 2000, so there's a sharp dividing line of 2000. I'm going to tell you what happened in 2000 in a minute. Probably a lot of you know. But before that, labor economists and trade economists essentially think that trade has not been a major contributor to the decline of the manufacturing sector in the United States, since it is not a significant contributor to the rising wage inequality in this country. And their theory is, if a sector such as manufacturing is hit by the trade, then the workers can either relocate to other geographical areas that has the kind of jobs that they specialize in, or they can retool themselves into, into different specialties, or they can just retire. They can go to non-employment. And this is the consensus before 2000. And then what happened? Probably everybody knows that China happened. In 2001, China entered the WTO, and this is what the manufacturing exports in the globe look like after 2000. If you look at periods after 2000, the uptake of China's share in the global manufacturing exports exploded. And this has single-handedly accounts for approximately 1/4 of the decline in the manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2007. And between 2000 and 2007, the manufacturing jobs in the United States declined by over 30%. So after the China shock, what economists have observed is the scar or the impact of this trade problem is actually much, much deeper, much, much serious than they had originally anticipated. So the empirical evidence actually runs against the consensus that I just mentioned. So what is the empirical evidence after 2000 in terms of adjustments of these local areas that are affected by the trade? What we saw is, so probably some of you sort of see this, that a lot of the areas that has been impacted by the trade shock has recovered in the last 20 years. And some of them has transitioned themselves to non-manufacturing sectors and service sectors, so on and so forth. But the important thing is, some of the very interesting, most recent study actually find that the people who actually working in those non-manufacturing sectors during the last 20 years were not the same people that used to work in the manufacturing sectors. So, and the inflow of workers to those areas were not manufacturing workers that got displaced from other areas. So what the theory has predicted in terms of the mobility across different geographical areas, mobility across different sectors, that didn't happen at all. So which means that the scar and the labor market impact on this trade actually has a much longer and deeper impact than what we have accepted, we have thought. And as I remember, that many of you that worked at DOL probably remember there was, or I think it's being terminated, there was a sort of a well-known program called TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, that we have spent actually billions of dollars over the last few decades to try to provide assistance to workers, firms, and farmers that impacted by international trade. And I was always wondering about why, because the most recent evidence was the national evaluation of that program that conducted in early 2000s, and the results of that evaluation is not effective. So we don't see an increase in employment or wage or their sectoral reallocation because of that program. And I was always wondering about that, but when I was reading these new studies, it's actually lined up with the results or findings from these studies. And also I wanted to mention that bringing these manufacturing jobs back to the United States, does that make sense? I don't want to say it makes sense. I don't want to say it doesn't make sense, but I just wanted to point out some facts. The fact is, we now have 12 million people that work in the manufacturing jobs. China has 120 million people working in manufacturing jobs. So that's one fact. The other fact is, there are around 500,000 manufacturing jobs vacancies unfilled on the labor market now. And it has been steady, 400,000, 300,000, 500,000 out there that nobody's want to take up those jobs. So again, I don't want to draw any conclusion. I think my role is just to provide you with the empirical facts, the data points, so that you can make your own judgment. The very last topic that I want to touch on is working from home. That the evidence, of course, is sort of not a lot because it's most recent phenomenon, but the work from home concept is actually being tracked for a while. But it has been very low, and it has been staying very low for the longest time. So in 1965, full days worked from home accounts for less than 0.5%, less than 0.5% of all paid work days in the United States. And over the next few decades, this percentage gradually increased. And I'm sure many of you know the reason. It's the IT, the high-speed internet, so we can have more technology to work from home. And by 2019, that's before the pandemic, it's around 7%. And the pandemic changed all of these, right? So it shot up to 61%, but then it didn't actually drop back to the initial level, to the pre-pandemic level. It stays around 28%. Even I think today, I think the most recent survey data suggests it's around 21% to 25%. So it's still 4 times larger than the pre-pandemic level. So this is the basic facts, but what's in it? So what are the heterogeneities in this rate? So what kind of worker likes to work, have a higher intensity, and what kind of worker has a lower intensity? Here's by industries. As you probably can imagine, the IT industry has the highest intensity of working from home, on average 2.5 days per 5-day work week. And then finance and insurance, professional and business services, those are the industries that higher paid, they're more flexible, and that's sort of why. So they are sort of a tool to better suit to work off-site, and that's reflected in here. And also it related to where you live. So the second graph on here demonstrates that the population density has a positive relationship with the intensity of working from home as well. What about the demographics? This is the demographics. The demographic group that has the highest incidence of working from home is from 30s to 40s. It's lower in the 20s, and it's lower for people around the retirement age. And that kind of in line with our expectation, right? So if you're in your 20s, if you just started your career, you probably want more professional connections in person, and you probably wanted more face-to-face mentoring, and you probably wanted to hang out with your friends and your coworkers. And that's the 20s. And when you hit your 30s and 40s, you have kids, now you can afford a larger house in the suburbs, and now you can get your work from home set up better. And that's why that we see a higher intensity of working from home. And once you're nearing your retirement age, you don't have kids to take care of at home, and you probably enjoy being around your coworkers or your friends in the office. So that's the age profile of working from home. One surprising fact here is there is really not a whole lot of difference between men and women if you take a look at the graph on the right. So in 2023, I think the percentage of full days work at the home as a percentage of total paid work days, it's 29% for female, 27% for male. It's not a whole lot of difference here, okay? And this is the last point I'm going to make. This is the most recent data after we see all kinds of return to office mandate. So the survey asks business executives, what do you think after you implement this return to office mandate that your workers, the proportion of your workers that's going to be in one of these bins, right? So it's fully in person, 3 or 4 days. And the top bar there is the situation prior to return to office mandate. And the bottom bar in there is what the business executives were expecting. It seems to me, at least for now, that this return to office mandate didn't move the needle much. And the last graph, we all talk about what's the potential impact of a recession on working from home. A lot of people say, oh, if you're hit by a recession, probably more people are going to go back to the office for various of different reasons. And that also doesn't borne out by the data. So these business executives were asked about, if there's a recession, if you see a large drop, a large increase on unemployment rate, what's your expectation in terms of your workers' work from home situation? And it didn't demonstrate a lot of differences from the current situation. I guess I'm running out of time, and that's all the data that I wanted to present.
Good. Thank you, the commentator.
All right, my name is Raymond Nardo. I am the moderator for the morning session. Based on what's going on in the last 6 months, I think we could use more moderation. But right now, initially, do we have any questions for the panel? No, he's commenting.
Well, I actually have some of the charts that weren't talked about, so I wanted to maybe start with those since we have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
One being a chart on foreign students in higher education and the impact of what's happening right now from your economic perspective.
Okay. Well, there was a chart that I didn't show.
Right.
And that looked at,
You need to use the
Yeah,
mic.
we need the mic, we need the mic.
Unfortunately, you got to speak into the mic.
I don't think it's working.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We're in our
better.
brilliant
Ooh.
system here.
Switch.
We are the
Thank you.
So, okay, great.
we are the intergalactic law school. Let me assure you of that. But we haven't figured out how to do microphones.
So I did have a chart that showed the increases in the number of foreign students at U.S. universities. And they actually have been rising very, very dramatically from 2000s to about the pandemic. And then around the pandemic, they began to fall a bit. But the question then is really what's the impact of them on the economy? I haven't done my own research on that, but there's other people that have. And the question, the answer really is that it increased the economy by about $44 billion. So by having foreign students at U.S. universities brings in a lot of demand for goods and services, for their consumption of meals, for consumption of other things. And that yields about, as I said, $40 billion. And it also brings in about 380,000 jobs. So having foreign students at U.S. universities is 380,000 jobs, $40 billion, is according to some studies. But that doesn't include the benefit of foreign students potentially staying here with their human capital that they have and basically potentially increasing the economy way into the future.
Let me ask you this question about it. So we bring in more foreign students, it brings us that net gain in GDP or whatever?
Right, right.
And that would not be true if we brought in American students to these universities?
Well,
Extra American
well,
students
I
would
mean,
also be consumers.
Of course, but the American students are already here, and actually, there's excess capacity in a lot of universities, and so bringing in foreign students actually increases the number of...
I know why universities like it, because I'm in a law school.
Right.
And we're funded.
It brings in tuition,
We're funded
too.
by our foreign students. Let me assure you, I understand that. That part I understand, but why is there a net increase in GDP from foreign students? Forget about the possibility they're going to bring their intellectual skills.
Right.
That would not be present with native workers.
Well, it's a net increase in population is
Oh,
what it
okay.
really is. And so if you have the American students here in general, that's fine. you have the regular growth rate.
So it's a net
But
increase
bring
in
in
population.
high-educated or potentially high-educated people in addition to who's here increases the growth rate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any questions?
I just had a quick question about the manufacturing jobs that are going unfilled, so the couple 100,000 that you talked about. What is the profile of those jobs? Are they like advanced manufacturing, and that's why they're not being filled? Or are they sort of the lowest of low in manufacturing settings? And just, what's the reason for that, and why aren't the workers going into them?
The unfilled manufacturing jobs, it's not a new phenomenon. Actually, that number didn't increase by a lot over the last decades or so. So it always has been there. So the vacancies and unemployment rate co-move, in time. And most economists would attribute those to mismatch. And there are two types of mismatch. One is a mismatch in terms of geographical location, and the other is the mismatch between the skills of workers and the type of jobs. So I haven't looked into the most current profile of the jobs that is unfilled in the manufacturing, but I suspect that it's still because of those two contributing factors that we will continue to see manufacturing jobs are not being filled in the way that it is now. But the other thing that I want to mention, since you mentioned about sort of within manufacturing sector, there are a lot of heterogeneities. And in terms of the type of jobs that we really wanted to bring back in manufacturing, those should be the high-tech kind of jobs. Those should be the jobs that matters to national security when it comes to manufacturing, right? So the kind of jobs related to garment and textile and whatever that we lost in the decades after 2000, I think we're okay that we don't bring those things back, right? Yeah. Does that end?
Most of these jobs in manufacturing were not high-tech. So I don't, high-tech, yes, I understand. That's a good thing.
All right, we have another
I
question.
got a question pending.
Yeah, having spent close to 15 years on Capitol Hill trying to get immigration reform done, my question is to the economists. The economic data is clear about the benefits of immigration to the country, and yet we can't get that established on Capitol Hill because, one, people don't, either they don't believe economists or the word of the economists are just drowned out by people who are calling the phone lines and saying, no, I think immigrants are taking my jobs away. I mean, I'm looking for your help in the sense of how do we get through the buzz in trying to get that message out? It hasn't been successful so far. And, there's all sorts of debate about the economists right now with regard to the deficit and the bills on Capitol Hill. But, with regard to immigration, we just can't get that truth established, and yet the economic data is so clear. I don't know if you have any helpful hints.
Which economic data is clear?
The economic data that immigrants are beneficial to America writ large, and yet, obviously, the immigration debate has gone south on Capitol Hill recently and become more restrictive.
Gotcha.
Unfortunately, I'm not a politician.
I think
So
that's a good
I
job.
don't know if I have an answer. There are a lot of lawyers in the room here, and a lot of politicians are lawyers. Maybe some people in this room can figure that one out. But I think that's a hard question. Political power is a little tricky. There are certain groups that benefit and certain groups that don't benefit. And therefore, each of them have lobbyists, and the lobbyists are lobbying for what it is that they want to lobby for. And so it's kind of a tricky business. Then everyone has to win an election, and you have to look at the relative different groups, or the relative sizes in the population and where they have the electoral votes and so on. And it's also true that, popular opinion is very, very different than what the true facts are. Certainly with respect to gender and race differences, there are a lot of popular facts which are not exactly consistent with all the facts. Actually, related to what Ye was saying with respect to race differences in earnings, it reminded me of another difference. I was looking at gender differences in earnings. It turns out that the gender difference for black and white for black workers, the gender difference for black workers in percent terms is smaller than the gender difference for white workers. And the reason, as Ye was saying, is that it turns out that black men have a much higher incarceration rate, therefore lower relative participation in the labor force over their lifetime, and black women have a higher relative participation than white women, and that's why there's a smaller wage gap for gender, the smaller gender wage gap among blacks than it is for whites. But for the politician's question, I think that's a really difficult question. Politics is very hard.
All right. We're-
One more?
One more?
Okay. Do we have any more questions? We get-
Charlie.
Charlie?
I was wondering if there's any parallels from the experience in the 80s when Japan was in the ascendancy in manufacturing internationally till today that we have with China. Is there any parallels whatsoever with the impact on the United States economy?
Well, we don't, if you look at the 80s, the manufacturing jobs in there, right, we don't see what happened we didn't see like what happened in between 2000 and 2010, right? So the magnitude is just, you can't compare the magnitude in terms of its impact on the manufacturing jobs here, right? And the types of goods that Japan manufactures and exports are also kind of different than what kind of goods that exported by China as well, right?
American companies were not subcontracting to Japanese producers. It's not the same situation we have now, right?
Yeah, and the labor cost is completely different.
Yes.
And with all the other restrictions but I think there's just no parallel there. And that's why a lot of economists are very shocked around 2010 and 2015 to see the adjustments to the so-called China shock in the manufacturing sector was just so slow and it's just so different than what they had anticipated before that.
Yeah. Thank you.
All
I
right.
just
Thank
want,
you.
thank you.
All
I
right.
just wanted
Thank
to
you.
say that there are seats, empty pockets around, and we are putting out another table, so I encourage
We're
you.
also bringing Deputy Solicitor.
Yes,
Acting
Ray will.
Solicitor Snare back to the table.
Okay, so
Because I
before,
miscalculated the time. John, where are you, John?
so before we begin our next panel, we will bring up Solicitor Snare for any questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.